conversation. So Stephen Brown is
Yeah.
the editor-in-chief of Politico EU, one of, if not the leading publications on EU matters. Prior to this, you were the bureau chief for Reuters in Buenos Aires, Stockholm, Rome, and Berlin. So I would like to just start off our conversation talking about the media and politics, and more specifically, the media in Brussels. So maybe if you could start off by explaining how Brussels as a journalistic ecosystem differs or is similar to the other European and global capitals you have worked in.
Yeah, I think the major difference is that it's not dominated by one nationality. So you tend to think of things in a very sort of multilateral mindset. So even though the national media here exist in their pods, they are interacting all the time with media from other countries. And so it means that you're exposed to, thinking about policy issues, political issues for Europe and for the rest of the world in a much broader sense. So you don't just see it in, the sort of UK or Hungarian or what have you sense. So that's sort of already a major difference from all the capitals in the world. Yeah. And then the other thing is your attention is switching to different institutions all the time. So, you might be writing about the Commission, the Parliament, the Council, or other institutions. Generally, it's sort of like the interplay between them. But it means that then if you're a British journalist and you're covering Brexit, for example, in Brussels, you are constantly being exposed to also what the Germans, French, or Lithuanians think about Brexit. And I think that's sort of quite enriching for journalists who are quite used to just sort of reporting down a fairly narrow tunnel of opinions.
Right, and to that point, what is the role that Politico plays as sort of one of the few publications in Brussels that doesn't necessarily have a nationality, or they're all concentrated in one country?
Yeah, that's actually that's sort of hopefully our advantage, is that we don't have to look at things through a national prism. So when we're writing about, for example, Hungary's the Hungarian relationship with the rest of Europe, we're not looking at it just for British interests or for Spanish interests or something like that. Typically, what we try and do is also we try and make links between the different capitals and nationalities. So, the richest source of stories at the highest level really is when you're linking up the thinking between typically Brussels, Paris, Berlin, and maybe London, Rome, or Budapest or Belgrade, depending on what the story is. So that's where we try and fit in. And we're also trying to sort of be a bit of a link between the way that United States and China typically, and also at other times Africa or India, what their relationship with Europe is as well. So it's all very linked up. But I think at the same time, what we don't want to be is the house publication for the European Commission or the European Parliament or Council. We want to hold them accountable, not have them think that they can dump documents on us and we'll just trot them out, or that we'll be their sort of spokespeople. So we're not bought into the idea, if you like. Neither do we oppose the idea. We're just writing about it, journalistically. As I said to someone once, if the European Commission, or the EU were to fail, it'd be a great story for us too. If it went down the tube, I mean, it's not going to, very unlikely to in the near future. But so we're not bought into the idea. We're not Eurosceptic, but we're not Europhile either. We just think it's a very good story that deserves telling. And I think the other thing is we also we focus very much on the policy as well as the politics. And I think that's sort of increasingly unusual in journalism, because it's much more attractive to write about the fun things that politicians say, or the sometimes shocking things that politicians say, and we do that too. But if you've also got to focus on what they actually do, are they putting through the policies, the legislation that they say they're going to do, and then are they implementing it, and then how is it being implemented? So if it's the more factual side of politics, I suppose we focus on as well. So upwards of 80 reporters, and I'd say more than 3/4 are focused on actual policy areas.
Right, and to that point, I mean, Politico is very much a product of the changing media landscape, and it is one of the most, both in the US and in the EU, one of the most successful sort of online publications, and maybe it gives this new media ecosystem maybe gives more opportunity to publications like yours to sort of find a niche of, being very policy focused in your area. How do you see the changing media environment and the shift from sort of print publications and more towards online?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I sort of worked in the news agency, in Reuters for a long time, where you didn't just exist on paper anyway. So I think, a lot of journalists have been used to the idea that, the media is electronic in some sense for quite a long time. I think what, the internet means is that is that media can start up, but also collapse, very quickly. So you can have media that make a great impact for a very short space of time and then disappear. So first of all, you've got to make sure you've got a sustainable business model. Sustainable business model also means that you've got more editorial independence, so you could do better journalism. There's lots of short-term opportunities where you can pop up, depend on clicks, do some very great sensational stories, but you're not really going to last very long if you do that. So you've got to tap into a readership that is, willing to pay, but also hopefully willing to pay for quality news rather than just sort of rather than rubbish. But it is a very competitive landscape as well. I think people are, one of the things that happened with Politico is that we saw that both in the United States and in Europe and in the UK, lots of other people see the opportunity that we've opened up, for example, in very focused political newsletters. So since we started up, lots of other people have started doing morning newsletters about politics, like our playbooks and our policy newsletters. That's great. And then I think one of the areas that's opening up a lot now is in podcasts, political podcasting, and even political radio. So you see the Times have opened up their new radio show, which has lots of radio. So it's quite rich at the moment. So I think people who are interested in politics can't complain that there's not a lot of stuff out there, not a lot of, a lot of variety, which there is. I suppose the question is the quality, and then also the angle. It does seem to be the case that increasingly lots of political news media feel a need to supply people with the news that reinforces their existing prejudices, rather than open their minds to new possibilities or new ideas. And that's a bit of a shame. At the same time, you do see lots of small independent media starting up. I'm thinking about things like The Critic, or quality media like like The Atlantic and people like that, who are opening up and trying to do quality media, that quality stories, good journalism. So it's a good time to be a journalist. It's just a bit tough at the moment because, of course, during the coronavirus, so many jobs have been cut because of the lack of advertising revenue for the media.
Right, yeah. And speaking of the coronavirus, if we now shift sort of to the different policy topics that we'll be discussing today. The EU's response to the coronavirus, there was obviously a 750 billion euro stimulus package, and I'd love to hear your commentary on that. But also, almost more importantly, that there is a shifting group of alliances and alignments within the European Council, and the new Frugal Four, and Germany's shift away from being, one of these nations that would have maybe considered itself frugal and more towards the support of the southern states. How do you see this shift, and also the impact of the recovery fund?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's a major shift. I was in Germany before coming here, as you pointed out, and they had this sort of devotion to the Schwarze Null, the black zero idea, the idea of having zero deficit. So I think the rest of Europe shouldn't underestimate what sacrifice, if you like, or at least how important it is that Angela Merkel and her government decided that they would ditch that in order to, first of all, bail out a lot of people in Germany, but then also shift to this idea of more solidarity with the rest of Europe. I think they also saw that the opportunity, the cost of not doing that would have been massive for the future of Europe. So I don't know how much choice they had, really, because Germany, as you know, is the biggest single economic beneficiary from the euro, for example, and therefore from the European Union. So they know very much that not coming to the aid of the rest of Europe at the biggest, crisis since the Second World War in many ways for this part of the world and for the rest of the world, would have done untold damage to the European Union. And you can say a lot of things about Germany, but their commitment to the European project, the Christian Democrats and who are in power at the moment with the Social Democrats, that's one thing they see, as do the Greens. There is no question of their commitment to the European project. So that's interesting, I think, and it has changed a lot of the atmosphere. The fact that then they reached a deal on the long-term budget, which included, of course, the recovery package. It was very surprising for us. A lot of people here who have covered previous budgets as well, and those are usually agonizing processes. I mean, it was long and hard, but the fact that they came to a deal at such a was interesting. And then as to the aid itself, I mean, one of the aspects that we're most interested in is the conditionality of the aid. I don't know how much you're interested in that, the sort of the political strings that are being attached to the recovery fund. But one of the most interesting debates we're seeing there is this idea that, okay, in order to qualify for this money, you need to also show that you are making progress on or adhering to European standards on the rule of law, freedom of the press, independent judiciary, etc. And this has created, if you like, a much more, so the new division, the old division, was north-south, along, is there enough money and is there solidarity? Now it's what is the cost of the solidarity? What do you have to pay? So it's more like Hungary and Poland, especially, who are, in Poland's case, actually yesterday, threatening to veto this whole recovery stroke budget process because they don't want to be forced to adhere to the rest of Europe's standards on the rule of law.
Right. Yeah. And I guess what's also another part of the sort of conditionality of this recovery fund is also the push from the Commission to make this a quote unquote green recovery that fits into the Green Deal. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and also the challenges to the Green Deal, because so far it is still quite a vague piece of, I mean, it's hardly legislation, and so everyone seems to be supporting it. But once countries will have to start giving up certain things, certain economic benefits. What you see for as the future of the Green Deal once we start drilling down on policy?
Yeah, well, I think this is going to be an area that we're going to have to hope that journalists and other people, NGOs and things, can pay a lot of attention, can put this under scrutiny for years and years, because at the moment what you have is a fairly powerful figure in the Commission, which is the first Vice President Jacobo Timmermans, who's in charge of implementing the Green Deal, and what he's trying to do is to make sure that every aspect of European Commission activity, so that's in trade negotiations or in sending money to other parts of the world, every aspect of it is green. So they want everything they do to be green. They of course want the recovery fund spending to be green, so not to be in conflict with their longer-term goals of emission cuts of 55% cuts in emissions by 2030, which is absolutely crucial and to which they are committed, and actually, with some areas of the European Parliament actually demanding even more than that. But I think we can agree that they will, stick to that 55% emissions cut target. The problem is, of course, is that you have national lobbies and then sectoral lobbies who really don't like that. So, what about the airlines, especially at the moment, when they're suffering from the lockdowns and the travel restrictions? What about the farm sector? What about particularly the coal industry? So somewhere like, again, Poland, how keen are they going to be on implementing the policies, which will mean the rapid shutdown of their whole coal sector, especially when their economy is hurting like everyone else is at the moment. And then I think there's going to be the green fraud. So how many of these programs are going to look green at the outside, and when you look at them more closely, are not going to be green on the inside at all. And that's typically the kind of thing where you have, so then you have, budget fraud around European Union states, which undermines the whole. When it is unveiled, of course, when it's revealed, it undermines credibility in the whole of the EU project. So it's crucial.
Sorry, I think my microphone was muted.
Okay. Yeah.
If we could move on to the issue of Brexit, which is obviously crucial to us here in the UK, and to those in the EU as well. First, maybe we can start off with your analysis on where we are in the negotiations, how likely a trade deal is. I saw an article in Politico the other day, or maybe it was yesterday, about the crucial problem of fisheries, which has maybe been amplified beyond its actual economic importance. So yeah, just maybe your analysis on where we are for a trade deal.
Yeah, it's very interesting that fish, which is such a tiny area of the, of the economy rather, has become such a, as you say, so amplified, for political reasons. Clearly, it's a bit of a distraction, I think. But we have seen that there has been progress behind the scenes on fish. But Michel Barnier has said so. I think there's much more flexibility there. I think the biggest stumbling block so far has been the level playing field. So this is idea, that the UK would accept similar or the same competition rules for its industry as the EU. Throughout this process, the UK has said, come on, you made a trade deal with Canada, which is much further away. It must be, it should be even easier to make a trade deal with us. Well, the opposite is true. The fact that the UK is so close and such a close partner is what makes the whole deal much, much more complicated, no? Because there's so much more trade being done. It's so much more integrated to the economy than Canada is into the UK. So it's a fallacious argument, really. But the fact that they've now also seemed to have reached agreements on the UK has ceded a little bit of ground in terms of the fair playing field. So therefore, in terms of revealing what its industrial strategy might be based on going forwards. And that's so crucial at the moment because the world economy is in such a bad shape, and because Europe, like everywhere else in the world, is thinking of, okay, trying to reshore more of its industry, more of its production. That's something, that has been shown to be a problem, especially with the response of the pharmaceutical sector to coronavirus. So if you're reshoring much more of your production and therefore also trying to have a much clearer industrial strategy, having a large economy on your doorstep which doesn't play by the same rules is very, very dangerous. So the EU is not going to give up on that. That's why I think there is going to be a trade deal. I think the cost to the UK of there not being a trade deal is huge. The cost to the EU of there not being a trade deal is absolutely huge. At the end of the day, the EU will act in the interests of Europe rather than national interests. And this is interesting because if you talk to German car makers, the famous German car makers are always cited by the Brits as people who are, who are absolutely terrified of no deal. German car makers, therefore Bavarian politicians, therefore all German conservatives, but then also the German social democrats whose supporters work in the factories that make the cars, they're much more interested in having open borders with their neighboring countries so that they can get the parts and the movement of all the manufactured parts around Europe freely than they are in the extremely important UK market. They're much more interested in that. And also a lot of European industry is, if you like, ideologically committed to the EU or economically committed to the EU. They just know that that's which side their bread is buttered on more than the UK. So they're not going to split on it. And one thing that Michel Barnier has done very, very well is to keep the EU united on this. It's absolutely remarkable, just as an outside observer, how unified the EU 27 have been on the Brexit talks. And they're also just much more accustomed to negotiating trade deals than the UK, who has had the EU to do it on its behalf for the last 4 decades.
Right, yeah, and thank you for that. Was a very comprehensive sort of analysis of where we are for the trade deal. I guess the two big questions about Brexit now are this one, the one of the trade deal, and then
Yeah.
what happens now that the UK is no longer a member state in the EU. I mean, we could go down the whole list of policy areas and discussions that happen in the council that the UK usually takes a big part of. But maybe the one where we could start is the area of defense and foreign policy, where the UK played such a pivotal role, and as sort of a counterbalance to France as the two largest military powers in the EU. And now that the UK is out of it, and does this mean that the EU will now come closer to building this famous or infamous European army? Does this mean that the EU, as President Macron has suggested, will start getting closer to Russia and maybe a little bit further away from NATO and the United States? Where does it go in this policy area?
Yeah, interesting. It's a very, very good question indeed. I think it's a fascinating subject. So yes, if you like, one of the clearest areas where the EU is going to be impoverished by Britain's exit is on foreign policy. I think, you know, on European policy within the EU, it's very interesting that, you know, the a liberal, if you like, free trade voice is going to be lost, and that leaves the, you know, a much smaller caucus of free traders like around the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden. You know, those people are going to have to fight much harder than they did in the past. But in the area that you're talking about, so I think, first of all, I think there will be incredibly close cooperation still. You know, there's a lot of details to be ironed out about intelligence sharing, data sharing especially. I think, you know, the sharing of data at any level between Britain and the EU is one of those sort of very technical and extremely important problems without which none of the other stuff will happen. So they've got to sort that out between now and the end of the year. That's particularly pertinent to the security relationship, to things like Europol. In terms of, I think Britain, Germany and France are going to continue to cooperate on the world stage in things like the relationship with the United States and with China through other fora, also the E3, also on things like Iran. I think, you know, they will continue to talk to each other there. I don't really see much of a problem there on most of those foreign policy things. They actually are pretty much in lockstep. Also, to be honest, foreign policy is an area where the EU underclubs. You know, the European External Action Service is not necessarily the most, shall we say, effective part of the EU, of the European Commission. You know, it's an extension of the European Commission. It's very good on the ground at providing coordination and actually at providing assistance in foreign countries. It's less good at providing, you know, a firm stance. So, you know, when Lukashenko, you know, declares that he's victor in fraudulent elections in Belarus, for example, is the EU effective? Not really. You know, it's sort of Lithuania and Poland are left to speak for the rest of Europe for at least the first couple of weeks there until the EU gets its act together. It's very interesting that you mentioned Macron. You know, he's clearly seen an opportunity to move in and become the hyperactive European leader on the world stage. The frequency of his trips to Lebanon, for example, was quite astonishing. On Russia, interesting, because obviously Germany, for, you know, in the whole post-war period, has had a much more sort of pragmatic attitude towards talking to Russia, as does Macron. And the Conservative Party in Britain, of course, especially some of the backbenchers at the moment have been much more hawkish on things like Huawei, also on things like the poisoning of Navalny and things like that. So yes, I think you're right that the EU, even though I don't think it will stop sort of imposing sanctions on Russia and on Lukashenko's government, it will be a little bit more accommodative towards Putin than it would have been if Britain had still been in the club. It's the sort of Chinese relationship which I think is the most interesting. So it's very interesting that Mike Pompeo, the United States Secretary of State, has been visiting Europe so assiduously to try and rally European support, especially around the question of 5G and Huawei, the Chinese tech firm's sort of presence in Europe. this is an area also where bits of the British government have been much tougher than most European states. So that is a relationship which I would watch extremely carefully. How does Europe deal with China in future without Britain in many of the negotiations? Especially they're sort of trying to build up an investment agreement with China at the moment. What will the Europeans demand as conditionality if they're in a position to demand anything in that relationship without Britain at the table?
Right.
Sorry, and on the terms of NATO, yeah, I think Macron may declare NATO brainless and that kind of thing. I think the Europeans are under such sort of, how should we say, pressure from especially eastern states, the Baltic states and Poland, to remain part of NATO. The Germans, of course, would despite some of the outward criticism, that is a country which is still very committed to the relationship with the United States. So I don't see any risk at all of Europe weakening its relationship to NATO. NATO headquarters are not so far from where I'm sitting now. I don't think, unless the United States undoes that relationship, which is more of a threat if Trump wins re-election, it won't happen from the European side, not at all. And the European army, absolutely no chance. You might get there are European divisions which already exist. There is a conversation going on at the moment about putting European boots on the ground, as they say, in Libya. Let's see what that actually means. It could be joint German-French division, but this would be the first time that the EU would deploy actual troops as the EU outside of Europe or at all. So that would be a big step, but I don't see much of a chance of them creating a European army. I think Britain would be very worried about that.
Right, and more broadly, sort of speaking about the EU's role in the world, it has often been described as a normative power because of this issue or fact that you just outlined of not having any real military power at an EU level. And the current president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has said that she wants to make this commission a geopolitical commission, I think is the phrasing she used. Where do you see sort of Europe's role in the world as maybe sort of this more soft power, this normative power, as opposed to, the Chinas and United States and Russias of the world, and just using the economic power rather than the military power?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So where does the EU actually have most influence at the moment around the world? Well, it's interesting. It's in quite technical areas like, like in competition regulation and tech regulation. That's actually real power. So the fact that the most of the world actually follows the EU's lead when it comes to things like regulation of industries is quite a lot of power indeed. So I think that's probably the closest they've got at the moment to power, if you like, and as you say, it is sort of its normative power. I think the whole geopolitical commission talk, so the previous commission, the Juncker Commission, was the political commission, and this one is now the geopolitical commission. Personally, I think it's rather meaningless. I think the coronavirus has also slowed down, if not put the brakes on it, almost entirely. So this was going to be the year of a big relationship between the EU and Africa. That has really slowed down quite a lot. I mean, there are still contacts between Brussels and the African Union in Addis Ababa. There have been visits and that kind of thing, but it hasn't really been, a major factor of change for those countries. I think the coronavirus has turned it into an emergency commission, really. No, it's been dealing with the commission, with the emergency. It's going to be dealing with the after effects of the coronavirus for years to come. I really don't see that there's much behind the talk about a geopolitical commission. It's an aspiration which I think coronavirus has blown away. Right,
and to sort of talk about the commission more broadly, or to drill down into the point of the commission, it's now a little over a year since since Ursula von der Leyen became president, and at the same time Charles Michel became the president of the Council and David Sassoli of the Parliament. And there was just sort of this broad restructuring of leadership in Brussels. Has there been a shift in direction for the EU? Obviously, the COVID pandemic has, changed priorities. So maybe has there been a shift before the COVID pandemic, after the COVID pandemic? Is this new leadership doing new things, or is it sort of just a continuation of the Juncker-Tusk years?
That's a very interesting question. Yeah, so the personalities have changed quite a lot, especially from the Juncker-Tusk years. But then quite a lot of the commissioners are actually the same, so a lot of the personalities, they're the same. A lot of the people behind the scene are the same. So there has been an attempt by von der Leyen to, if you like, gradually replace some of the people associated with Jean-Claude Juncker and with his chief, who was Martin Selmayr. That's happening quite slowly. I think they've actually turned into a much more, they've had to be responsive or reactive, if you like, rather than active on the world stage because of the virus. That's absolutely true. It's quite a hermetic, if you like, commission. So it's actually quite difficult to see how they come about making decisions. There's a lot more. There's a very strong relationship, if you like, between the Parlement, where the commission sits, between the top levels, and Berlin. So we know that there's a very fluent conversation happening between Parlement and Berlin. We also know that von der Leyen, there's a lot of talk of her being put in her job by Macron. I think that's probably overstated. But it does seem that she's playing more of a, the commission as a bureaucracy of the main capitals than the commission, telling them what to do. So it does seem to be that she's the first commission chief who hasn't been a national leader. She was a minister, under various roles in the German government while I was in Berlin, but she hasn't been a national leader, and I think you can actually tell, frankly. Charles Michel had been Belgian Prime Minister, and being Belgian Prime Minister is pretty tough. It's all about consensus building. So he's, in many ways, ideally made for the role of, ideally trained for the role of Council President. But it's interesting that the Commission has become, if you like, more about coordinating between the capitals than imposing itself. If you listened to to von der Leyen's State of the Union speech, recently, she sort of touched upon everything. She ticked all the boxes in terms of all the different things, that the Commission wanted to do going ahead, but there was no big message. There was no major takeaway from that speech. It was sort of nice sounding stuff, but it was something for everyone, and it didn't really show a strong character. And if you like, I suppose that's the big difference. Jean-Claude character, for all of his foibles, Jean-Claude Juncker, excuse me, for all his foibles, had a very strong character, sometimes too strong for some people's taste. The von der Leyen Commission hasn't developed its own character yet.
Right, and to that point of showing leadership, in recent weeks, the Commission has tried to show some leadership on anti-racist policies in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and the George Floyd protests, and it has put forward an quote-unquote anti-racist action plan, which includes some legislative proposals as well as some broader and vaguer statements on shifting attitudes. Does it have sort of the moral authority, like many presidents and heads of states do, to at moments of crisis and protests like this, to address the nation and its citizens? Does the Commission have the same sort of moral authority to address the citizens of the EU, and does it sort of carry the same amount of gravitas that heads of states do?
Well, there's a couple of things there. I think one of the things is people in glass houses don't throw stones. If you go to the European Commission and indeed the European Quarter of Brussels, it's whiter than white. So it is not a very racially diverse organization at all. In a city which is actually very diverse, so just a stone's throw away from the European Commission, you have Matonge, which is the area of Brussels where the people from the former Congolese colony, live. So it's actually quite a diverse city, very diverse city. The European Commission isn't. European Parliament does a bit better. European Council, not very much either. So does it have the moral authority in that sense? Well, difficult, not as much as actually a lot of the national governments do. This is an area, again, where the European Commission and the Parliament in particular is going to look a bit worse after Britain's exit, because this is where Britain did perform quite well. There were many more MEPs of different racial backgrounds from Britain than from any other country, as far as I recall. Yeah, so that's been lost with Britain's exit. And then you've got to think that whatever the European Commission, says in terms of nice words in its anti-racism action plan, a lot of the countries that make up the European Union have pretty poor records on this kind of thing. Some of them, for example, Hungary has a government which frequently says things which are have underlying feeling of anti-Semitism. And then some of the other newer member states, in terms of the status of their Roma population in particular, I'm thinking, really don't have a fantastic record either. And I think in terms of, action plan against racism, it's much more likely to be the national governments that are going to act there. We've seen a few encouraging signs here after the Black Lives Matter protests. Some of the what had previously been support in the Dutch government, some areas of Belgium for black faces. Yeah, so these are this Schwarze Piet thing. It's a sort of carnival thing where people go on blackface in carnival parades. So finally, some Belgian and Dutch politicians have said, OK, that's not a good thing. It's not a good look. And they are saying that they're going to try and get rid of it. But it was not given by the European Commission. The example there came from the protesters themselves, from the Black Lives Matter protests. I think it's much more likely to come from the ground up, to be honest.
Right. Yeah. And to the point of how wide the EU decision-making forms are, I think I recently read that there has never been a commissioner of color and so, I mean, this is just one example. And as you said, there is every member state in the EU seems to be at different points with reckoning with their systemic racism and internalized racism. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. I mean, you have worked in all different European capitals and seen sort of like how race is handled on a political sphere. I was recently reading an article on Politico about a Black labor organizer in my home country, which is still a country which has very few people of color in its political decision making and in parliament. So I was wondering if you could just sort of compare how race is dealt with in the politics of different member states.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's, I don't want to be hypocritical here either, because I think the media actually doesn't do very well on these counts either. Yeah, let's be honest. So the media needs to do a better job of reflecting more the diversity of its audience too. Media, generally draws upon people who come from pretty privileged backgrounds and, generally pretty white as well. So first of all, hands up there. We in the media need to do a much better job, and then we can also hold the people in government to account much better as well. It's interesting, I also worked for a long time in Latin America, where we had an enormous amount of sort of racial and ethnic diversity and things like that, and it was people, if you like, talked about racial diversity a lot less. And got on with it a bit more. So it was just sort of like, it was much more organic. But then, of course, they also, don't have, many of those countries don't have the same sort of colonial legacy. They were on the receiving end rather than the other end. I think the problem in Europe is still that so many of the countries are still in a colonial mindset in one way or another. You can see it in the discourse, of some members of the British government at the moment. They cannot separate themselves from sort of 19th century jingoism. And you can see that in the structure of sort of high society in Belgium. As you say, I lived in Italy a few years as well. It's interesting that, the kind of things that you hear on the football terraces, the kind of attitudes that you see towards, people from Africa and Italy can be quite shocking. At the same time, Italy has also shown a lot more compassion to people, people coming across the Mediterranean on boats than lots of the other countries have. I think it's impossible at the moment for you to think that, that the Hungarian government, for example, and the French government or the Spanish government are going to see eye to eye on a lot of these issues. Can the European Commission, possibly the European Parliament, even more usefully, play a role there? I think that's the kind of thing where actually the European Parliament can play a role. People are quite disparaging of the European Parliament, saying that it's got no power and that kind of thing. It's very interesting that a lot of the countries that are more committed to the European project and to sort of making this a common sort of civilized space for everyone's benefit, take the European Parliament more seriously. They send people of higher qualification level, more senior people with actual expertise to the European Parliament, therefore contribute more to the debate. And some of the more Eurosceptic areas, send pretty low-grade people. So I think there's a good opportunity there to take European Parliament more seriously and make the European Parliament a place which can hold European countries and the European structures more up to scrutiny on issues like race, but also, demographics, also in terms of poverty, how you treat people, young people, how you treat old people. And, we're heading into a period of economic, it's going to be challenging for a lot of people. A lot of people have been thrust into poverty by the virus, and many more will too because of the economic impact. And so this is the kind of area where the European institutions, not just the Commission, but possibly the Parliament, can play a useful role.
Right, and to sort of wrap the conversation up, if we could talk just for a minute about the future of the EU, I mean, the EU seems to constantly be in crisis, and also aside, because every government is constantly in crisis, but
yeah,
every crisis seems to be an existential crisis for the EU.
Yeah.
And there always comes a moment where one of the heads of states, be it of Germany or of France, or at the time of the UK, comes up on the stage and says that this crisis might end the EU once and for all. So this crisis of coronavirus, and then the crisis of climate change, and then the continuing populist threat to the EU. How do you see the next 5 years for the European Union, and where do you think we'll be in 5 years?
Interesting. Yeah. So I think you say it's in constant crisis, existential crisis. That's absolutely right, or at least that's the rhetoric. It's interesting because if you're British, you don't have much of an option if you're the British government about remaining British. But what your option is to remain or not remain a member of the EU. So the EU is a useful whipping boy for all of these people. The governments that you see at the moment, which are most opposed to Brussels, which are having the biggest fights with Brussels, do not talk about leaving the EU. So I'm thinking of Poland and Hungary at the moment, for example. In Italy, it came up a little bit, around the sort of post-financial crisis, but it was, I never really saw a very serious threat that Italy would leave the EU, despite, disagreeing with it about some things. So the optionality of it, of course, makes it easy to say, well, we could just leave. You can just leave, but the cost will be huge. Brexit is going to show, in my opinion, over the next couple of years, just how much of a cost leaving the EU has for a country. And that's not because Brussels or, you know, the government in Berlin or Paris or Rome or Madrid or anywhere are going to try and make the, you know, London learn its lesson. That's absolutely not the case, and that there's no sense of that, you know, from Brussels I get whatsoever. No one wants Britain to suffer because it's left the EU. Okay, they also don't have an inherent interest in giving Britain any, you know, special deal more than they would give to anyone else because they have left. You know? But Brexit will, I believe, show the cost of leaving the EU, except that, of course, it will also be very easy for British governments over the next 5 to 10 years to blame the European Union for the economic ills that will befall the country because of Brexit. That's also true. So you can expect a lot of that. They're not exactly going to say, yes, this is because we left the EU. No, even the Remainers, you know, who are in the Labour Party and in the Tory Party have now sort of signed up for Brexit. So they're not going to be saying, you know, no, it's our fault. We shouldn't have left in the first place. There doesn't seem to be any political capital in that. But it is my belief that the EU itself, you know, these core countries will remain together. They've got so much to gain from staying and so much to lose leaving. You know, countries like, you know, the Netherlands have had their, you know, strong Eurosceptic movements and Eurosceptic moments, but a lot of those people are also, you know, some of the Eurosceptic movements are not exactly having a great crisis at the moment. So I'm thinking of, you know, Salvini, who has his Eurosceptic moments, the Five Stars. You know, Salvini is not very strong at the moment in Italy. Wilders in the Netherlands is not doing particularly well in the polls. The Alternative for Germany has really shrunk since it, you know, stormed into the German parliament. So the Eurosceptics are not doing particularly well around Europe at the moment. If anything, there's a lot of demand that, you know, why couldn't the EU play a bigger role in something like the coronavirus? Clearly, more coordination would be better and would have been better. So more powers over things like health coordination, procurement of medicines, vaccines, health equipment, more centralized power to do that would have been a good thing. So I think you might well see discussion about actually giving the EU more powers rather than less. They talk about, you know, people don't really think about this much in Britain, but in Europe they talk a lot about the federalists. These are the people who would turn the EU into, if you like, United States of Europe. That debate's not going away. Now what we've got is talk about the leadership of this new quango called the Conference on the Future of Europe. This is something that France very much wants, and it will happen. And they will be discussing, you know, the future of Europe. I think that's going to be a very interesting process. It sounds like a bit of BS at the moment, and there will be a lot of BS attached to it. But I think it's a very interesting process, because is that going to be the process where we see the Europeans say, actually, we do want to federalize a little bit more, or quite a lot more?
Right, and I think this point is a great point to end on you know, waiting for this conference on the future of Europe. So I'd just like to thank you so much for your time. This has been a really interesting conversation, and we'll upload this to YouTube, and all of our members will see it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Not at all, Tommaso. It's been an absolute pleasure and very good questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.